Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to Where All the Ladies At. This is a podcast where I take a deep dive into history, myth, and legend, and really shine a light on amazing women that seem to have either been forgotten or overlooked or just written into a smaller part. I am Kim. I'm your host. I am a history nerd. I am a mythology lover and an archaeology groupie, and I also just happen to be a writer too. So if that sounds like something you're into, this whole podcast idea, then cool, stick around, right? For those that have been around for a little bit, I have some announcements to make. So starting next month, you're only going to get 2 episodes a month from me, one for myth, one for history, and that is done specifically because honestly, trying to do 8 episodes a month is a lot of time. And because I've been devoting so much time to that, I have let other things slide, like my Medium, my social media, and I want to be able to give a full integrated, I forget the word. This is what happens to writers sometimes. I want you guys to get everything. I want to diversify and give you guys enough platforms and lots of different types of content to really enjoy. So that's why I'm cutting back. I still love the podcast. It's still going to be here. I can't stop sharing these with you. But what it is going to afford me to do is that coming up soon, on my Patreon, on my Buy Me a Coffee, there will be stuff available for you to purchase. There will also be a newsletter there. The stuff to purchase right now is going to be ebooks. I currently am working on finalizing editing the first one, which is on Elizabeth Bathory, and I have started work on the second one, which will be based in mythology. There will be some mythology and some history books over there. In the future, there may also be merchandise. There's, like I said, definitely going to be the newsletter. So I'm going to be able to offer you things in order for you to feel, I just want you guys to feel like if you support me, you're getting most bang for your buck. Is kind of idea. Also, there'll be more traction on my social media, so you'll start seeing more stuff over there. In a couple months, I should have a website up, so there'll be that as well. And all kinds of good stuff coming from that. I think, so that's kind of what's going on. It's also going to allow me to spend more time on Medium, so you'll have more stuff over there. And so I think it's just going to be an all-around great way. Plus, I'm also trying to launch a business, so I need the time. So I think you'll still get good quality and maybe even better quality because I'm not trying to edit, so many podcasts. And I can actually put a little more time into these things. So yeah, that's what's going on, but as always, if you want to reach out to me, you can still do that. I have social media, and as I said, it will start being more functional. I have TikTok, I have YouTube, I have TikTok, I have Instagram, I have Facebook. I also have YouTube if you want to watch the video. If you don't have any social, you can always still reach out to me through my email. If you want to support the podcast, like, comment, share, follow, subscribe, do all those kind of things. Financially, as I said, I do have a Buy Me a Coffee and a Patreon, and right now it is just donation based, but coming up soon you'll have some stuff that you can purchase. If you want more on this and so much more, the Medium publication, which is going to be more in depth, coming up as well. And if you are into magical, mystical, spiritual stuff on the side note, then you might want to check out my other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip. And by the way, those over there will only get 2 episodes as well. I had been doing 8 with them, so total I've been doing 16 podcasts. So we're going to pare it back a little bit in hopes, at least for the next 6 months, and then we'll see where we go from there. And I think that's it for the shameless plugging and housekeeping. Now we can get into today's topic, because this is the last episode we are celebrating Pride Month in. I'm very, very honored to be able to do this and share these amazing women of the community with you. And today I, of course, saved, I don't think the best for the last, because I think the other ladies were pretty kick-ass, but maybe one of the most important for the last, and that is Barbara Gittings. She is basically the mother of LGBTQ plus rights. She wasn't just like this rebel. She was like a revolution, and she was, she's everything. And let's let's start by looking at what life was like in the United States as she was growing up. It's newsflash, it wasn't great. It wasn't very welcoming to people that were different, especially women, and especially queer women. So let's talk. So let's look. All right, so let's picture this. It's 1930s. The United States is still wrestling with the Great Depression, and this period had a tight grip on nearly every family, right? Jobs were rare, survival meant, making some impossible choices. For women, life was very hard, right? You had to balance the desperate need to provide for everything, along with the duties of a good wife and mother, right? If you had ambition, it wasn't about that, It could only be really, really whispered in the shadows. Women were potentially kind of just looked at as secondary to, and when it came to their potential. When it came to motherhood and homemaking, they were right up there, topped in, right? But it was a patriarchal society, still is. So when 1940s rolled around and World War II started, everything started to shift, right? It was millions of guys were shipped out, right? That left factories and offices and farms that needed to be still working. And when the men ship out, the only people left were women. So this is where the idea of the Rosie the Riveter came in, right? Women rolled up their sleeves, and they jumped in the jobs, they learned new skills, and they really held the nation's economy together. And if you ask my opinion, they really helped it flourish, making it better than it was before the men had gone. Coincidence? I don't know. But with this empowerment, though, came something else. You had independence and pride, but you also kind of had this like sword hanging over you. It was like you knew it was temporary, right? It wasn't a permanent social change. The women knew that when the war ended, the nation would then push them back into the kitchen and sewing rooms and, back into suburbia. So in the 1950s, hold on a second. I'm moving my notes. All right. So in the 1950s, you had the ideal American life, right? The men had come back from the war, so the women were all back, right? And it was served up to everyone in magazines and TV shows, right? Beautiful homes, perfect families, clean-cut gender roles, right? Women were meant to be the perfect homemaker, so happy and compliant and devoted to the husband and children, and and the queer folks were, as always, underground, right? Homosexuality was pathologized, it was criminalized, and it was feared. And a lot of people felt like it was almost like a contagion, right? It was looked at in scientific fields as a mental illness, and laws punished it harshly, right? Public visibility for queer people was dangerous, so you had to be secret. It was the only way you could do it, the only way you could shield yourself from being arrested, from being fired, from being excommunicated from your communities. And this was the world that Barbara Gittings was born into. It was one where being queer was not only taboo, but it was a severe threat to your survival. And that's pretty scary, right? So when we look at women, we kind of talked a little bit about it, right? But let's go a little deeper, right? Seriously, what was life really like for women? Here's the thing. Feminism had been kind of coming in waves, but it would move a little bit forward, and then that wave would draw back, right? And teeny ripples would keep going, But most women were pretty boxed into one area, right? So when it came to work, they could be teachers and nurses, secretaries. All of these were respectable options if your woman wanted to work, right? But most of the time, these were undervalued, really paid low, and basically looked at as women's work, right? Because women's work at that time was really looked at where it didn't need to have the same respect or compensation as a male dominated job, right? And ambitious women who wanted to dream bigger really were looked at with hostility and kind of skepticism, like what's going on there. Rights wise, you know, the 19th Amendment in 1920 had given women the right to vote, white women, and that was a pretty big victory. But beyond the ballot box, you know, there was workplace discrimination, societal expectations really shackled the women to like these roles that maybe some of them wanted to be in, and that is perfectly fine, but some of the people did not want to, right? Women were expected to marry young, prioritize family, keep opinions quiet, especially on things like politics and sexuality. You know, the old side, you should be seen and not heard, was really attached to women and more than children at this time, right? Social norms were really rigid and very unforgiving. So if you dared to step outside of those lines, you know, you were risking pretty harsh treatment. For queer women, that it was even higher, right? For queer men and women, but since we're with some podcast for women, right? Because they had to live under this invisibility cloak, right? They were forced to hide their true selves because they didn't want to get arrested, right? They didn't want to get blacklisted. They didn't want to get rejected from their family. They didn't want to be ostracized from society. You know, if you were openly out at this time, that was like defiance and danger, and that's why many people didn't do that. But Barbara Gittings came of age in this atmosphere, you know, and you had to be silent and conform, and that was your protection. Yet she would become one of the very few to drop that invisibility cloak, right? And she was very bold, and she stood in the light. And that, because she did that, it really like held, you know, created this groundwork for future generations, so that they could live more authentic lives. And that's why I really wanted to save her to last, and that's why I really wanted to cover her, is because without her, you know, although all of us in the community probably wouldn't, you know, I'm sure there were other people involved, but she was one of the big ones. So let's take a look at Barbara Gittings. So, you know, though the rights and laws and freedom is still, we're still working on getting a lot of acceptance. I couldn't imagine growing up in a climate where you had to be silent and afraid and invisible, right? And I know some people grow in that environment still, but back then it was the norm, and maybe it still is the norm. Maybe I'm a little, you know, naive, but you know, I think it's not like it was back then. Maybe that's what I should say. You know, and she was born in 1932. She was born in Philadelphia. And, you know, rich American history, but it was really cloaked in this rigid conservatism, right, when it came to gender and sexuality. There was a lot of brutal contradictions as she was growing up, right? You had the lingering hardship of Great Depression, you had World War II, and then domestic expectations in the 1950s. And from a young age, Barbara knew she was different. She came out very early. She came out in her teens. That was a pretty bold and rebellious act in the time when that word lesbian itself was it was like a bomb. It was like a bomb, you know, and really only whispered in the shadows. And this was an era where the LGBT plus community existence was criminalized, like I said, pathologized. There was shame put on it, you know, and she really it was an act of her self-acceptance was an act of defiance, you know. And though it was kind of the beginning was very quiet and courageous, you know, she still sought to educate herself. That's kind of what I was trying to think of how to say, you know. So she looked at libraries, you know, but they barred books that had any leaning towards homosexuality, right? She still sought them out, right? She wanted to read stories that reflected her truth. And you know, that's a pretty big quest in an era when, you know, those kind of things were forbidden. So she started connecting with other lesbians, creating secret networks of solidarity, you know, because the world demanded invisibility, right? But all of that was in her teens. Where her big turning point came was when she entered into college, as is most of our story, right? As she went to Temple University, and there she encountered new ideas and communities that really started to like ignite that fire of activism, right? The intellectual environment really allowed her to kind of deepen her understanding of identity and injustice. And it was here that she met other women who had become, and they would become lifelong allies and fighters for the cause. You know, by 1958, Gittings had helped found the New York chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis. And this was like this was the first lesbian civil rights organization in the United States. It was pretty revolutionary, not just because it was advocating for rights, but it really carved out a space that that allowed for the lesbian community to start to build, right? And that was pretty amazing. Between 1963 and 1966, Barbara transformed the Daughters of Bilitis' magazine, The Ladder. She started, you know, it started kind of as this cautious, really coded newsletter, but really she was like, no, we're gonna make this into a very fierce, very proud, very unapologetic voice for the community. So The Ladder became really the first original queer zine. It was bold, it was vibrant, it was unafraid to name lesbians' lives, struggles openly. It really talked about all the things that, you know, the community was feeling, but just out in the open instead of trying to whisper it in back rooms, right? But Barbara didn't just put words on the page. She wanted presence and visibility. So she organized the annual Reminder protest, and that started in 1965. There were early pickets in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. These protests were there to demand rights for the LGBTQ plus people. These protests were not the explosive Stonewall riots, but they were brave, they were disciplined, and profoundly important. They definitely sent a message that the community existed, and they wanted dignity, and they didn't want to remain invisible in the shadows anymore, right? So as, you know, Barbara Gittings' activism really rippled beyond those picket signs, though. In the early 70s, she was a key figure in Montemouth campaigns to convince the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexual from the DSM. And this was pretty revolutionary. You know, for decades, homosexuality had been branded a mental illness. And that because it was drafted as that, people discriminated, there was abuse, rejection, right? When you're told that something is a mental illness, then you think you can cure it. But she was persistent, and so she really helped dismantle that harmful myth. And eventually the APA decision in 1973 was to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness, and that was a pretty landmark victory, right? It kind of reshaped medical and public perspective of the community itself. It wasn't really just a policy change. It was basically, it helped create a seismic cultural shift that kind of opened more doors and made the community more accepted. It opened doors for legal rights and also for a little more dignity, right? She really laid the groundwork for queer rights movements that we know today. She not only talked about the community, though, she really talked about feminist struggles too, right? And she really wanted the community to be tied in with the feminists, because even feminists sometimes segregated themselves from that. She really challenged everybody that really wanted to stay in the shadows and really wanted everything to stay silent, that it was okay to step into the light, right? And it was okay that you be seen on your own terms. And that's a pretty amazing thing. It really encouraged a lot of amazing things and really brought this hope to the community as well. So I think that's one of the biggest things. Yeah, so I think there's something pretty special about Barbara's journey, definitely a sign of authenticity in the face of fear, and I think she really kind of brought the revolution. She asked the questions like, what does it mean to be truly seen and known? How do we live unapologetically as ourselves when society is demanding us to be something else? Barbara's life really teaches that courage isn't always like this, like, in your face, rolling, roaring lion. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's necessary, but sometimes it can be stable and quiet and just consistent. She was very happy saying, here I am, here we are, this is me, either you like it or you don't, right? And I think that that's pretty amazing. And that is Barbara Gittings, and that is the end of the celebration for Pride Month. And I hope through looking at all these individuals, that you're inspired to go check out more and learn more. And for those that are in the community, learning the history, and for those that aren't, maybe learning the history and trying to understand. And maybe that dialogue will help heal some of the wounds, yeah, I think that's it. That's Barbara Gittings, guys. As always, if you want to reach out to me, you can do that through social media. If you want to support the podcast, like, comment, share, follow, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. Financially, go to my Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon. If you want more on this and so much more, check out my Medium publication. And if you want to talk about spirituality, mysticism, tarot, astrology, all that kind of cool stuff, check out my other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip. I hope that you guys go learn more about Barbara Gittings, more about Audre Lorde, more about Billie Holiday, more about Frida Kahlo, and all the other amazing women that have been a part of the community. And until next episode, guys, stay safe, stay curious, stay blessed.